Remember when a trip to the bakery window was the highlight of the week? Back in the 50s and 60s, British bakeries were packed with simple but much-loved treats like sticky Chelsea buns and soft-iced buns, to homely rock cakes and sweet jam tarts. These bakes weren't just food, they were part of everyday life, bringing comfort to tea times, school dinners, and Sunday afternoons. Let's step back in time and rediscover 15 classic British bakery favourites that deserve a spot on today's shelves. Jam tarts were one of the simplest yet most beloved bakery items in 1950s and 1960s Britain. Made with a basic short crust pastry, these little open-faced tarts were filled with dollops of bright fruit jam, like raspberry, strawberry, or apricot being the most common. The preparation was straightforward. Flour, butter, and a touch of sugar were rubbed together to make the pastry, rolled out thin, cut into circles, and pressed into small tins before being spooned with jam and baked until golden. They were cheap, easy to make at home, and therefore a staple in school lunchboxes and on tea tables. Working-class families in particular loved jam tarts because they stretched a little bit of jam into many servings, making them economical yet satisfying. Children adored them for their sweetness, and bakeries always kept a tray of them ready for quick sales. They weren't fancy or reserved for special occasions. Jam tarts were everyday treats that brightened up an ordinary day. Eccles Cakes were a slightly richer pastry treat, originating from Eccles near Manchester. They were made with flaky puff pastry circles filled with currants, sugar, butter, and a touch of spice like nutmeg or allspice. Once baked, the sugar caramelized inside, making the filling sticky and sweet, while the pastry crisped beautifully. To make them at home, bakers would roll out puff pastry, cut it into rounds, spoon in the filling, fold the pastry over, flatten slightly, and sprinkle sugar on top before baking. Eccles cakes were widely eaten with afternoon tea, often by adults rather than children, as they were a bit more filling and less playful than jam tarts. They were especially popular in the north of England, but could be found across the country in bakeries in the middle of the century. Clerks, shop workers, and housewives often bought them as a pick-me-up with tea, while kids jokingly called them squashed fly cakes because of the currants inside. The Manchester tart was one of the most iconic school desserts of that time. It consisted of a short crust pastry base, spread with raspberry jam, topped with a thick layer of custard, and finally sprinkled with desiccated coconut. Sometimes a banana slice was added before the custard, though this varied by region. Making it wasn't too complicated. The pastry was blind baked, then layered with jam, custard made from milk, sugar, and egg yolks, and finally finished with coconut. It was most commonly served in school canteens, often cut into squares or slices, making it one of the defining puddings of post-war childhood. Working-class families enjoyed it at home too, as the ingredients were cheap and widely available. For many, biting into a slice of Manchester tart instantly brings back memories of noisy school dining halls, plates clattering, and children trading crusts for custard. The tart wasn't elegant or refined, but it symbolised a generation's sweet comfort, hearty, simple, and unforgettable. Chelsea buns were a more indulgent bakery item, first made famous at the Chelsea Bun House in London centuries earlier, but still popular in mid-20th century Britain. These buns were made from enriched yeast dough, spread with a mixture of currants, brown sugar and butter before being rolled up, sliced and baked. Once out of the oven, they were brushed with a sticky sugar glaze, giving them their characteristic shine. To make them at home required patience, kneading the dough, allowing it to rise, filling and rolling it, then baking until golden and sticky. They were usually eaten as an afternoon or tea time treat, often reserved for weekends when families had more time to bake. Working-class families sometimes bought them from bakeries as a small luxury, while middle-class households were more likely to make them from scratch. Their richness made them a favourite of adults, rather than small children. though everyone loved pulling apart the sticky spirals of sweetness. Iced buns were perhaps the ultimate childhood treat of the 50s and 60s. These soft, slightly sweet bread rolls were topped with a thick layer of white icing that stuck to your fingers as soon as you touched it. Some bakeries sold them plain, with only the icing, while others filled them with cream or butter. They were made from a simple yeast dough enriched with a little milk and sugar, shaped into long rolls, baked, then coated with glossy icing sugar glaze. They were inexpensive and could be found in almost every high street bakery. Children adored them, rushing in after school with a penny or two to spare, while adults enjoyed them alongside a cup of strong tea. Many remember the joy of peeling the icing off first, nibbling the sweet layer before tackling the bun. For countless families, iced buns were not just food, but a small ritual of happiness, a taste of post-war optimism wrapped in sugar. Lardy cake was a proper old-fashioned treat, heavier than most bakes but loved for its sticky sweet flavour. It was made by folding lard, sugar, dried fruit, and spices into bread dough, then baking it until the top was dark and caramelised. The lard kept it moist, while the sugar gave it a lovely chewy crust. To make one at home, you'd roll out the dough, spread the lard and fruit mixture, fold it up, and repeat until it was well layered before popping it in the oven. It wasn't the sort of cake you had every day. It was more for weekends or when someone managed a trip to the local bakery. Lardy cake was particularly popular in the south of England, but soon enough it was found in many towns. It was a working man's cake, really, something filling to go with a cup of strong tea after a long day. Madeira cake was the opposite of fussy baking. Plain, pale yellow and light, it was the kind of sponge you could cut into thick slices and serve without fuss. It was made from eggs, butter, sugar, flour, and sometimes a touch of lemon zest. The top often cracked in the oven, which was seen as a good sign. To bake it, you'd cream butter and sugar, add the eggs one by one, stir in the flour, and let it bake until golden. It got its name not because it contained Madeira wine, but because it was once eaten alongside a small glass of it. By the 60s, though, it was more likely found next to a pot of tea. Housewives often baked it as a reliable cake that lasted a few days in the tin. It wasn't rich or fancy, and more of an everyday sponge that suited anyone, young or old, wanting a simple sweet bite. The Victoria sponge was a true classic, and in the 50s and 60s it was a centrepiece at village fêtes, church gatherings, and family teas. Two light sponges sandwiched together with raspberry jam and sometimes a layer of whipped cream, dusted on top with a shake of icing sugar. The making was straightforward: butter, sugar, eggs and flour, beaten well and baked into 2 even rounds before being filled. It was the kind of cake nearly everyone could bake, and it became a symbol of home comfort. Middle-class families often prided themselves on making a neat one, while children simply loved biting through the soft sponge and jam layer. Many people still remember walking into a grandmother's kitchen and seeing a Victoria sponge sitting proudly under a glass dome, waiting to be sliced when visitors popped in. It wasn't just a cake, it was a taste of welcome, a reminder of simpler times when a slice and a cup of tea felt like the height of kindness. These tarts were a bit more delicate than most everyday bakes. Originating in Richmond, they were small pastry cases filled with a light curd cheese mixture, sweetened and sometimes flavoured with lemon. They baked into golden little tarts that were rich yet not too heavy. To make them, you'd line small tins with short crust pastry, mix the filling from curd cheese, eggs, sugar and flavouring, then spoon it in and bake until firm but soft inside. They weren't something you saw in every bakery, more often in special tea rooms or made for afternoon gatherings. They had a touch of elegance about them, which meant they were more likely enjoyed by the middle classes or served at Sunday teas when company came over. Children sometimes found them a bit too grown-up compared to jam tarts or iced buns, but they carried a sense of tradition and charm for those who liked them. Rock cakes, sometimes called rock buns, were rough little mounds of dough dotted with dried fruit. Despite their name, they weren't really hard, just crumbly and rustic in shape. They were made with flour, butter, sugar, an egg, and whatever fruit was to hand, mixed together and dropped in small heaps onto a baking tray. Quick to make, they were often the first recipe children learnt in school cookery classes. Back then, rock cakes were the sort of treat you'd see on kitchen tables during the week, not too sweet, but filling enough to go with a cuppa. Families of all backgrounds ate them, as they were cheap and easy. For many, the memory of rock cakes brings back afternoons with mum or gran, sitting in a warm kitchen with the smell of baking filling the air. Their uneven, knobbly look never mattered. What mattered was that taste of homely comfort and care. The Swiss roll was one of the prettiest cakes on the bakery counter back then. A light sponge was baked thin, spread with jam, sometimes cream, then carefully rolled into a tight swirl. When sliced, it revealed neat red spirals of jam against the golden sponge. Making one at home took a steady hand, as the sponge could easily crack, but clever bakers used a sugared tea towel to roll it while still warm. It was a treat for tea parties, birthdays, or Sunday afternoons. Families across Britain enjoyed it, as it wasn't expensive to make and looked impressive on the table. Children loved seeing the swirl pattern, and often picked out the jam first. It wasn't reserved for the rich or the working class. The Swiss roll was for everyone, a cheerful cake that felt just a little fancier than your everyday sponge or bun. Custard tarts were one of Britain's oldest and most loved bakes, and by the mid-20th century, they remained a firm favourite. They were made with short crust pastry cases filled with an eggy custard, mixture of milk, sugar, and yolks, baked gently until just set. A sprinkle of nutmeg on top gave them their classic look and flavour. To make them at home, you'd blind bake the pastry shells, pour in the custard, and bake until they wobbled but weren't runny. Bakeries sold them either as small individual tarts or larger ones cut into slices. Custard tarts were eaten by everyone, like school children with a penny to spare, office workers grabbing a snack at lunchtime, or families having one with their tea. They weren't overly fancy, but had a certain comforting richness, which made them stand out among plainer cakes. For many, a custard tart was the perfect balance between simple ingredients and satisfying flavour. Bath buns were sweet, yeasted buns that stood out thanks to their sugar-crusted tops. They were often sprinkled with crushed sugar lumps or caraway seeds, and sometimes had currants baked inside. The dough was soft and slightly rich, making them more of a treat than an everyday roll. To make them, you'd need a simple yeast dough enriched with milk, butter and sugar. Shape them into rounds and bake until golden before topping with sugar. In the 1950s and 60s, they weren't as common as iced buns or Chelsea buns, but most bakeries carried them. They were especially popular for Sunday teas or when guests came round. Many people remember being given a bath bun on a plate with butter, the sugar crunching on top as you bit in. It was the sort of bake that felt just a little special, a reminder of days when a bun and a pot of tea could turn a plain afternoon into something warm and memorable. Parkin was a traditional cake from Yorkshire and Lancashire, deeply tied to the north. Made with oatmeal, golden syrup or treacle, butter and ginger, it baked into a dark, sticky cake that got even better after a few days in the tin. The ginger gave it warmth, while the syrup kept it moist. To make it, the syrup, butter and sugar were melted together, mixed with oatmeal and flour, then baked slowly until firm but chewy. Parkin was especially linked to bonfire night, eaten alongside the fireworks and sparklers of early November. In the 1950s and 60s, it was mainly a northern favourite, though it was known further south as well. Working-class families often baked it at home, since the ingredients were cheap and filling. Its strong flavour wasn't always to children's tastes, but it remained a traditional cake that connected families to their roots and regional pride. Treacle Tart was one of the cosiest desserts of post-war Britain, and by the 50s and 60s it had become a household favourite. Despite the name, it was usually made with golden syrup rather than black treacle. A short crust pastry case was filled with syrup, fresh breadcrumbs, and lemon juice, which balanced the sweetness before being baked until golden and set. The result was sticky, sweet, and comforting. It was often served with custard or cream, making it a regular feature at Sunday lunches or school dinners. Families of all classes enjoyed it, as it used simple cupboard ingredients and stretched well to feed a crowd. For many, the taste of treacle tart brings back childhood memories of steaming bowls in school halls, or the smell of it baking in the family oven on a cold evening. It was the kind of pudding that felt like a hug in food form, all sweet, homely, and a reminder of how simple pleasures once meant everything. And that's it for today's trip down memory lane. Give it a like if you remembered having some of these sweet treats, and don't forget to subscribe for more information and nostalgia. See you next time.